For years, Meg Ryan was careful when Rob Reiner's name surfaced in interviews. She smiled, deflected, and spoke in the polite language Hollywood teaches its survivors. Fans assumed that silence meant harmony, or at least a chapter gently closed. But when Meg Ryan finally decided to speak without filters, what emerged was not scandal. It was something far more unsettling: clarity. She did not frame her story as an expose. There were no explosive accusations, no attempts to rewrite history. Instead, she spoke with the calm of someone who had spent years revisiting memories, turning them over slowly, waiting until they stopped hurting enough to be honest. And honesty, she made clear, was never encouraged in the rooms where power lived. Meg recalled her early collaborations with Rob Reiner as transformative, both professionally and personally. At the time, Rob was already a towering figure, respected, influential, and trusted by studios to shape not just films, but careers. Meg was rising fast, adored by audiences, yet privately unsure whether she was being seen as a serious artist or simply a perfect smile. Rob, she said, had a way of commanding attention without raising his voice. On set, his confidence filled the room. Decisions were swift. Opinions carried weight. For a young actress eager to prove herself, that authority felt reassuring at first. When someone seems certain, Meg explained, you assume they know what's best, even when it starts to feel uncomfortable. What fans were not prepared to hear was how often that discomfort went unspoken. Meg described an environment where questioning creative choices felt like questioning loyalty. She emphasized that Rob was not overtly dismissive or cruel. In fact, his praise was frequent, but conditional. Approval came when alignment was total. Disagreement, when it surfaced, was met with silence rather than confrontation. That silence, she said, was the hardest part. Not arguments, not raised voices. Silence that made you wonder whether you were imagining the tension at all. Over time, Meg began adjusting herself to fit the rhythm of the room, speaking less, doubting instincts, choosing harmony over honesty. You don't notice it happening, she said. You just realize one day that you've gone quiet. She was careful to stress that this dynamic did not come from malice. It came from imbalance. Rob Reiner carried institutional power. Meg carried emotional responsibility. The films benefited from that equation. The people inside it paid the cost. Perhaps the most revealing moment in her account came when she spoke about how success complicates truth. When a project is celebrated, when audiences applaud, when critics praise chemistry and brilliance, it becomes nearly impossible to admit that something underneath felt wrong. Gratitude becomes a muzzle. You tell yourself you should be thankful, Meg said, so you swallow what doesn't sit right. Years later, with distance and perspective, she began to understand that admiration does not cancel discomfort. Respect does not require silence. And collaboration does not justify erasure. These realizations, she admitted, did not come easily. They arrived slowly, often accompanied by guilt. Guilt for speaking at all, guilt for not speaking sooner. Fans were especially struck by her explanation of why she waited so long. The answer was not fear of Rob Reiner himself, but fear of the system around him. A system that rewards compliance, protects legacy, and quietly punishes those who disrupt the narrative. There's a cost to telling the truth, she said. And earlier in my life, I couldn't afford it. By the end of her reflection, it became clear that Meg Ryan was not attempting to dismantle Rob Reiner's reputation. She was reclaiming her own voice. She acknowledged his talent, his influence, and the magic they created together, while also naming the emotional toll that magic required. And in doing so, she offered fans something rare in Hollywood storytelling. A reminder that even the most beloved creative partnerships can contain unseen fractures. That brilliance on screen does not guarantee balance behind it. And that sometimes the most powerful revelation is not what was done, but what was endured quietly for far too long. As Meg Ryan continued, the conversation shifted away from film sets and into something far more personal: the aftermath. What happens, she asked, when the applause fades and you are left alone with the version of yourself you shaped to survive someone else's certainty. That question, more than anything she said, lingered heavily with fans. She admitted that for years after those collaborations, she struggled to separate her authentic instinct from the habits she had learned. Deference had become reflex. Silence felt safer than clarity. Even in rooms where she now held power, she sometimes found herself waiting for permission that no longer needed to be given. "You don't just walk away unchanged," she said quietly. "You carry the echo with you." Meg was careful to distinguish between intent and impact. She reiterated that Rob Reiner likely never viewed himself as someone who diminished others. In his mind, she believed he was leading, decisively, confidently, the way Hollywood had always rewarded men for doing. But leadership without reflection, she noted, can unintentionally silence voices that are still forming. What surprised many listeners was her willingness to include herself in the responsibility. She did not frame herself as powerless. Instead, she spoke about the choices she made to stay agreeable, to remain indispensable, to be seen as easy to work with. At the time, those choices felt strategic. In hindsight, they felt costly. "I participated in my own quieting," she admitted, "because I thought that was the price of staying." As her career evolved, so did her understanding of that price. Stepping away from the spotlight for periods of time was not, she said, a retreat from acting. It was a search for recalibration. She needed to remember what her voice sounded like when it wasn't being measured against someone else's authority. That process was slow, uncomfortable, and deeply private. When asked why she chose now to speak, Meg did not cite a single trigger. There was no final incident, no recent conflict, no dramatic reckoning. Instead, she described a gradual shift. Age brought distance, distance brought perspective, and perspective brought responsibility. At some point, she said, silence stops protecting you and starts protecting the wrong things. She acknowledged the risk of being misunderstood. In an industry that prefers heroes and villains, nuance is inconvenient. But nuance, she insisted, is where truth lives. Her story was not about tearing someone down. It was about naming an experience honestly, without disguising it as gratitude or nostalgia. Fans were particularly struck by her reflection on legacy. "Films endure." Quotes live on. Behind-the-scenes dynamics rarely do. Yet those dynamics shape lives just as profoundly. Meg said she hoped her honesty would encourage younger actors, especially women, to trust their discomfort before it calcifies into self-doubt. "If something feels off," she said, "you don't need permission to feel it." Near the end of her remarks, Meg Ryan addressed the inevitable question. Did she regret working with Rob Reiner? Her answer was measured and sincere. No, the work mattered. The art mattered. But regret, she explained, does not always cancel gratitude. Sometimes they coexist uncomfortably in the same memory. She closed with a statement that reframed everything she had shared. "This isn't about the past," she said. "It's about the patterns we keep repeating when we don't talk about it." By choosing to speak now, she was not reopening old wounds. She was preventing new ones from forming in silence. For fans, the revelation landed not as a shock, but as a reckoning, a reminder that Hollywood's most cherished stories often have unseen layers. That power can be subtle, and harm does not require cruelty to be real. And that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is tell the truth, not when it is loud, but when it is finally clear. By the time Meg Ryan reached the final moments of her revelation, the weight of decades seemed to settle into her voice. She spoke less about individual events or disagreements and more about the quiet accumulation of moments that shaped her understanding of herself. The story was no longer about Rob Reiner in isolation, nor about Hollywood's pressures. It was about the subtle ways in which influence, power, and proximity can change a person without them realizing it. She described afternoons on set when the cameras weren't rolling, when the crew had scattered, and the rooms felt suddenly enormous and silent. Those were the times she felt the full extent of the imbalance. It wasn't cruelty, she explained, And it wasn't neglect in the conventional sense. It was the slow shaping of expectations, an unspoken agreement that her presence was acceptable only if it conformed to an invisible standard. Over time, that standard became internalized. She carried it with her even when she was no longer working with him. Meg paused to reflect on the irony of visibility. To the outside world, she was celebrated, admired, and adored. Every smile, every performance seemed effortless. And yet behind that perfection, she navigated a constant internal negotiation. When to speak, when to nod, when to push back, when to yield. You learn quickly, she admitted, that silence can be louder than words. She revealed that those lessons left their mark far beyond the sets of her films. Relationships, friendships, and collaborations all became measured by caution. Trust was harder to give. Boundaries required more vigilance. It was not bitterness she carried, far from it, but a heightened awareness of the cost of deferring too often. Fans listening closely could sense her deep empathy for younger actors, especially women, who face similar challenges. She spoke directly to them, urging them to recognize when influence crosses the line into quiet suppression. You can admire someone, she said, and still honor yourself. You can respect their talent and still speak your truth. Her words were not theoretical. They came from years of practice, missteps, and reflection. What was most striking in her account was her insistence on balance. She did not want to diminish Reiner's achievements or the magic they created together on screen. She repeatedly noted the brilliance of his craft, the transformative power of his direction, and the moments of genuine connection that made their collaborations unforgettable. But she also reminded listeners that talent does not excuse the emotional shaping of those around you. Brilliance on one side should not overshadow humanity on the other. She reflected on the passage of time, acknowledging that perspective changes everything. What once felt like subtle pressure, she said, later felt like guidance. And later still, it felt like a pattern I needed to recognize. Time allowed her to see both the beauty and the cost, without collapsing one into the other. The films endured, yes, but the lessons endured too. And in speaking now, she ensured that the lessons would be seen clearly, without distortion. Finally, Meg turned inward, sharing the most personal truth of all, how she reconciled admiration, gratitude, and unease. She admitted that it took years to reclaim her voice fully, to disentangle herself from habits of deferral, and to understand that honesty does not betray respect. She learned that saying what she felt did not negate the collaboration that had shaped her career, it completed it. As the conversation drew to a close, the silence that followed was profound. Fans could hear it as a pause between words, a weight carried with care. She had spoken not for shock value, nor to rewrite history, but to share a human story of influence, compromise, and ultimately, self-realization. It was a quiet kind of revelation, one that left its imprint precisely because it did not shout. In the end, her message was simple but powerful. The people we admire can shape us in ways we do not immediately recognize, for better or worse. And sometimes, the bravest act is to look back with honesty, speak with courage, and reclaim your own story. Meg Ryan's truth, delivered decades after it began, reminded everyone listening that even in glamour, lights, and applause, the heart keeps score, and the heart deserves to be heard. Even after decades, Meg Ryan admitted, the weight of those experiences never fully disappears. The applause fades, the awards gather dust, and the headlines forget you. But the echoes of choices made, words left unsaid, and moments silently endured linger. In her conversation, she described an internal ledger, one she kept meticulously, not of failures or blame, but of awareness. Each interaction, each subtle negotiation, each suppressed instinct added to a quiet history she alone could measure. She recalled the paradox of visibility in Hollywood. To millions of fans, her life appeared seamless, joyful, enviable. Cameras captured her laughter, interviews captured her charm, and performances captured her brilliance. But behind the lens, she navigated a constant tension between admiration and authenticity. Being seen, she said, doesn't always mean being understood. Often, the louder the applause, the quieter you feel inside. Meg reflected on the nature of mentorship and influence. Working with Rob Reiner had been formative, but formative in ways that required careful unpacking. She learned techniques, timing, emotional layering, the craft of acting itself. But she also learned to measure her presence, to monitor her instincts, and to adjust herself constantly to maintain harmony. In hindsight, she realized how often subtle authority can shape behavior without overt control. She spoke candidly about the moments when admiration collided with unease. Days when she felt compelled to laugh when she did not fully agree, to remain silent when her instincts screamed otherwise. These were not moments of confrontation, nor were they dramatic incidents. They were moments so ordinary that no one else noticed them. But together, they accumulated into patterns that shaped her perception of herself. You start to wonder, she admitted, if your reactions are really yours, or if they've been influenced by someone else's certainty. Fans listening were struck by the nuance of her account. She did not frame herself as a victim. She did not paint Reiner as a villain. Instead, she offered a portrait of human complexity, authority and talent coexisting with subtle imbalance, admiration and compromise existing side by side. It was an honesty that asked the audience to feel, not judge. Meg also addressed the power of time and distance. With years removed from those intense collaborations, she had space to reflect, to recognize patterns, and to reclaim her narrative. She spoke about learning to trust her instincts again, to speak without permission, and to honor the discomfort that once kept her quiet. The silence that once protected me, she said, now protects nothing. It only delays truth. As the conversation deepened, she explored the emotional consequences of deferral. Relationships outside of work were shaped by the habits she carried from a set: caution, careful listening, hesitation to assert needs. Recognizing this, she said, was both painful and empowering. It allowed her to reset expectations and approach new collaborations with clarity. You carry lessons forward, she explained, and if you are wise, you carry them as guidance, not guilt. Perhaps most poignant were her reflections on gratitude. She acknowledged the joy, growth, and creative magic of working with Reiner. She celebrated the moments of brilliance they shared, the films that remain beloved decades later. Yet she emphasized that gratitude does not erase subtle harm, nor does it excuse silenced instincts. Both can coexist, and both must be named to be understood. Near the conclusion, Meg Ryan offered a message to audiences, particularly young actors and aspiring creatives. Your instincts are valid, your voice is necessary, and the lessons learned in silence are meant to guide you, not cage you. Admiration and respect for authority can coexist with the right to question, assert, and speak honestly. You can honor the past, she said, without surrendering yourself to it. As the interview ended, the weight of what she revealed lingered, not as scandal, not as shock, but as a meditation on influence, resilience, and reclamation. The story was neither simple nor dramatic in the conventional sense. Its power lay in subtlety, in the spaces between applause and quiet, in the decades it took for truth to emerge fully. Meg Ryan's words left fans with a rare insight, that the most profound truths are often those held in silence for years, finally spoken when clarity outweighs fear. And in doing so, she reminded everyone that personal history, even amid glamour and acclaim, deserves to be witnessed, understood, and honored. As Meg Ryan spoke in these final moments, the conversation shifted from memory to reflection, from recounting experiences to understanding their meaning. She emphasized that her journey with Rob Reiner, like many relationships in Hollywood, was not defined by a single event or a single choice. It was shaped by decades of small moments, decisions made quietly, words left unsaid, and the gradual accumulation of influence. She described how those years of working under someone with authority had taught her both resilience and caution. Every interaction carried weight, every choice had consequences. But she also acknowledged the lessons learned in those quiet struggles. They were not just about survival. They were about understanding human complexity, recognizing patterns, and ultimately reclaiming her own voice. I had to relearn what it meant to be seen, she admitted. Not as a star, not as an image, but as a person with thoughts, instincts, and boundaries. Fans listening could feel the depth of this realization. It was not bitterness that shaped her words, nor resentment. It was clarity, a recognition that admiration and discomfort can coexist, that influence does not always equate to understanding, and that personal growth often comes at the cost of silence. She reflected on the irony of visibility. The world applauded her, yet the most important truths about herself were invisible for decades. Meg also spoke about how time can heal, or at least clarify, experiences that once felt suffocating. Distance allowed her to see patterns she had internalized, to differentiate between guidance and control, and to separate respect for talent from the cost to her own voice. I needed to see it clearly, she said, to understand the lessons, not the pain, to take what I learned and carry it forward without carrying guilt. One of the most powerful aspects of her reflection was her discussion of agency. She acknowledged her own role in her journey. The moments she chose compliance over assertion, harmony over honesty. She emphasized that agency is not simply the ability to act freely, but the ability to recognize when conformity becomes self-erasure. That insight, she said, had taken decades to fully embrace. Meg turned toward the idea of storytelling itself. The way Hollywood narratives often gloss over nuance, preferring heroes and villains, triumphs and disasters. Her story, she explained, did not fit neatly into that framework. It was messy, human, and deeply instructive. Influence can be subtle. Power can be gentle and still reshape those around it. Recognition does not erase impact, and admiration does not excuse compromise. She addressed the young actors and fans who had looked up to her for guidance. Her message was deliberate and earnest. Your voice matters. Your instincts are valid. Do not allow the brilliance of others to dim your awareness of yourself. Respect can coexist with honesty. Admiration can coexist with boundaries. And the lessons learned in the quietest, smallest moments often shape you far more than the moments the world notices. By the end of her remarks, Meg Ryan's tone softened, carrying both relief and resolve. She acknowledged the beauty of her collaborations, the magic of the film she created, and the formative impact of those experiences on her career. But she also affirmed the importance of reclaiming her narrative, speaking her truth, and honoring the internal work that had taken decades to complete. The interview concluded not with drama, but with a profound stillness, the kind of quiet that lingers after honesty has been spoken. Meg Ryan's story reminded listeners that influence is never neutral, that admiration does not preclude reflection, and that reclaiming your voice is one of the most powerful acts of self-respect. For fans, the revelation was not shocking in the tabloid sense. It was far more meaningful, a meditation on power, growth, and the subtleties of human relationships. And as the conversation ended, one truth remained clear. Even amid glamour, acclaim, and applause, personal experience deserves acknowledgement, and the courage to speak it, no matter how long it takes, is a gift both to yourself and to others who may one day walk the same path. Even as the cameras stopped rolling, Meg Ryan's reflections lingered in the air. She spoke of the quiet aftermath, the way lessons learned in silence echo long after applause fades. The experiences she recounted were not confined to sets, scripts, or scenes. They lived in everyday choices, in relationships both professional and personal, in moments when she had to decide whether to assert herself or defer once again. These were the true markers of her journey. She reflected on the paradox of success. To the outside world, Everything appeared polished, seamless, and enviable. Awards, accolades, and public admiration painted a portrait of triumph. Yet within, there had been a constant negotiation, a careful weighing of instincts against expectations. It was not always clear where admiration ended and self-censorship began. Over time, Meg realized that the lessons she had absorbed, both the empowering and the limiting, were inseparable from her career and her life. Meg spoke of influence as a double-edged sword. Working with Rob Reiner had offered guidance, mentorship, and insight into the craft she loved. But it also demanded adaptation, adjustment, and a subtle reshaping of how she expressed herself. Authority need not be harsh to leave its imprint. The most profound influences are often the invisible ones, shaping decisions, behaviors, and self-perception quietly, almost imperceptibly, until they become part of who you are. She emphasized that recognizing these patterns was not about blame. Reiner's brilliance and her admiration for him were never in question. Rather, it was about awareness and reclamation. Understanding doesn't erase history, she said, but it allows you to carry it forward differently. That distinction resonated with many who had followed her career, and with anyone who has felt the subtle weight of authority shaping choices in ways that are not immediately visible. Meg also addressed the enduring power of storytelling. Hollywood often favors simplicity, heroes and villains, victories and failures. Her story did not fit neatly into that mold. It was complex, layered, and deeply human. There were successes intertwined with struggles, admiration intertwined with caution, learning intertwined with self-doubt. And yet it was precisely this complexity that made her reflections so meaningful. It reminded viewers that the stories behind the spotlight are rarely straightforward. She spoke candidly about reclaiming agency, a theme that had defined much of her later reflection. For years, she had deferred, adapted, and measured her words to navigate environments of authority. But with distance, perspective, and confidence, she could assert herself without apology. The process was gradual, sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately liberating. Reclaiming your voice is not a confrontation, she explained. It is an alignment with yourself. Fans were especially struck by her discussion of gratitude and perspective. She celebrated the magic of her collaborations, the moments of inspiration, and the art that resulted from working with talented, demanding individuals. Yet she made clear that acknowledgement of value does not erase the cost. Both could exist simultaneously. Respect for what was created and recognition of the emotional toll required to participate in it fully. By the conclusion of her account, Meg Ryan had shifted from recounting experiences to offering wisdom. Her reflections became guidance not only for young actors, but for anyone navigating power, influence, and professional relationships. Speak your truth. Trust your instincts. Recognize patterns. Preserve your voice. The lessons of her journey were universal, extending far beyond the confines of Hollywood. Finally, she circled back to silence and the courage it takes to break it. She noted that the most significant revelations are often delayed, not because they are less important, but because understanding takes time. Speaking truth after decades of reflection carries weight precisely because it is deliberate, thoughtful, and measured. Is honesty shaped by experience, not impulse? Meg Ryan's closing thoughts left listeners with a lasting impression. The world sees the accolades, the performances, the public moments. But the true story resides in the unseen, the subtle, and the quietly endured. And in acknowledging that truth, she offered both a personal reckoning and a gift to her audience. A reminder that clarity, courage, and reclamation are not only possible, but essential.